Hello and welcome to this single case design research presentation focusing on multiple baseline and multiple probe designs. But first, let's review. Let's talk a little bit about visual analysis and the AB/AB withdrawal design. In review, analysis of graphics is a hallmark to single case research design. It requires visual examination of data as it changes across conditions. Analysis of graphics can help us understand the basic variables of a study. Primarily, we know our dependent variable is on our ordinate axis or the y-axis. With a label, you can see percentage of intervals with inappropriate vocalizations is the behavior intended to change with this intervention. You also know the number of sessions, days, or weeks as noted along the abscissa of your graphic. Across time, the intervention is either in place or it is your baseline condition or treatment as usual. So here you can see we have baseline condition, treatment as usual, moving on to a self-management condition where the student observes his or her own behavior and responds accordingly. A return to baseline condition, and as another self-management condition, where the sessions in which the student independently initiated the self-management is noted with an asterisk. Therefore, we know not only is a dependent variable the percentage of intervals with inappropriate vocalizations, but the independent variable was self-management, and in some occasions, independent initiation of self-management. Additionally, you have to ask yourself, does the design permit assessment of experimental control? Is there a functional relation here? So how do we evaluate experimental control? Well, we want to look for prediction. Looking at the first condition, we would predict that if procedures remain the same, the data would also remain the same. But our hypothesis is that if we put an intervention in place at a certain point in time, we will have a change in behavior. That's our verification. And then we have a return to the baseline condition and see if indeed under baseline condition behavior is at a certain level. And lastly, we see the behavior in a new condition of the intervention again, return to previous intervention condition levels. We have a replication. We have 3 replications of effect here. And of course, we want to know about that functional relation between the DV and IV. We might have experimental control because we have 3 replications of effect, but have the data changed across conditions in a way that is important. Well, what do we need to look at? First of all, we look at level. The level is the median value of any individual condition. Remember, we get median by putting the data points in order from smallest to largest, and the median is the middle number. Therefore, the median of A here would be 4. So the baseline condition here would be at a level 4. However, when we go to our intervention condition B, our median is 8. So we have a change in median level from 4 to 8. We also have an absolute level change from 3 to 8, or 5 points. We see that the level returned in A back to 3, an absolute level change from 9 to 3. By having stable data, we can feel confident that there are no confounding external variables and that our prediction of continued data would be able to be within a certain range. So we want stable data. We want 80% of the data points to fall within 20% of the median value. So at the very least, we have 3 stable data points before changing condition. Here we have stable data points. here we have stable data, and here we have returned back to the previous levels. Additionally, we want to know about our trend. Is it accelerating, decelerating, or zero accelerating data? Is it in a therapeutic direction or contra-therapeutic direction? In this example, we have no trend, zero accelerating trend here, possibly a therapeutic trend, accelerating trend here, and then a return to baseline condition, and again, zero accelerating. We want to make sure we have enough data points, so we need at least 3 data points in each condition, as long as they're stable data points. Across conditions, we just want to know if there's an immediate and abrupt change in level or trend. And of course, we want to be sure to see as little overlapping data as possible. So the percentage of non-overlapping data, or the P&D, here is 100%. So that would show effective treatment. And of course, we want to know if it's a socially valid impact. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the effects are good enough for the student to be able to participate in the community, improve quality of life, and move on to the next skill necessary. And moving on to the next part of our review, the ABAB withdrawal design. The withdrawal design is analogous with the group design, with the exception that we're using baseline logic. The student, him or herself, is the control group, as opposed to 2 different group averages being compared. We have a student learning under normal conditions and a student learning under the intervention conditions. But with an AB case study, some conclusions can be made. That's a baseline and then an intervention. If it is highly frequent and ongoing data, and you have stable data, and you have immediate and abrupt change with a lot of replications, maybe you did that with 20 students and you saw a replication across each of those 20 students, then that strengthens what you can say about an AB design. But ultimately, AB design is a correlational design at most, and we need to have 3 replications of effect with 1 student in order to show a functional relation and experimental control. So it's better to return to baseline and replicate. Okay, now on to the main feature, multiple baseline probe design. Here we go. The multiple baseline design may be the most appropriate single case design to use for a variety of reasons. The multiple baseline design may be the most appropriate single case design to use for a variety of reasons. 1. When a withdrawal design is not feasible due to ethical concerns with withdrawing treatment, we should consider the multiple baseline design. 2. Practically speaking, more than 1 person or setting may need the intervention, making a multiple baseline or multiple probe design better for the group. 3. The independent variable may not be able to be reversed or withdrawn. For that reason, the multiple baseline probe design would be a good choice. 4. The multiple baseline or probe design is very versatile and easy to understand, so they can be generally practical in real-world settings. And lastly, if you have multiple measures being used to obtain data over 2 or more baselines, yet the end result appears visually as a series of AB designs stacked upon each other. These reasons will work under the multiple baseline design because it uses multiple measures to obtain data over 2 or more baseline conditions, and therefore you get end results that appear visually as a series of AB designs stacked upon each other. Some experts conceptualize each baseline, be it different behaviors in the same individual, different settings where the same individual's target behavior is occurring, or different individuals are exhibiting the target behavior in the same setting, as differing target behaviors or dependent variables. Each baseline followed by an intervention is treated as a separate applied behavior analysis, so each tier is essentially a new dependent variable. Now, I will generally refer to these as tiers. They will either be 3 different individuals, each serving as a separate tier, 3 behaviors to change using the same intervention, each behavior being a separate tier, or 3 different settings. After baseline data have been obtained for all 3 tiers or dependent variables, the practitioner or researcher implements the intervention for the first dependent variable while maintaining the same conditions for others. When the criterion is obtained for the first tier, the intervention may be implemented and analyzed in regard to the second tier and then the third. Consider this. A teacher approaches you about a student in class who has continuing issues with severe cursing in class, on the bus, and at home. This target behavior has become so pronounced that it is possible the individual may be pulled from the inclusive setting. His parents are also embarrassed and frustrated by his cursing at home. On the bus and at recess, peers are complaining that the student is breaking the rules. Which multiple baseline design might be appropriate in this case? Let's review the different dependent variables that the multiple baseline or multiple probe would be tiered across. Individuals, behaviors, or settings. Take a look at this graphic. Note, we have the same behavior, word spelled correctly. There's no mention of setting changing. However, we do have 3 different individuals. That indicates that this is a multiple baseline design across individuals. So each tier represents a different individual student. Let's look at this graphic. Here we have the same dependent variable again. However, we're not noting different individuals. These are different classes or settings that the one individual is in. So social studies, math, and science. So this would be a multiple baseline design across settings. When choosing a multiple baseline and multiple probe design, we need to think about how we've established a functional relation and also how to make 2 specific predictions to ensure we will have the best chance of showing that functional relation. First, we consider prediction. Collecting baseline data simultaneously across all dependent variables or tiers allows the practitioner or researcher to infer a verification of prediction that the baseline behavior would have remained stable and unchanged if intervention had not been implemented. Then we look for verification. We want to see if it is evident that the data path changes in a predictable manner through each condition change. If there is no change, then verification is not evident. If there is change, then it is possible that the independent variable is responsible for the change, and there is verification that the data path changed with introductions of the intervention. And lastly, we're looking for replication. We want to make sure it is seen when data paths across tiers display similar patterns. If potential confounding variables are held constant across tiers 1, 2, and 3, the prediction is valid, and if changes with tier 1 are observed after introduction of the independent variable and patterns are replicated across tiers, then a functional relation is seen to exist. We need to consider these 2 predictions when deciding whether each of our tiers are good choices. First, we need to know if the behavior, settings, or individuals are functionally independent. This means that implementing the intervention on one behavior, setting, or individual wouldn't automatically impact the other two tiers. At the same time, we would like to make sure that the behaviors, settings, and individuals are functionally similar, meaning if they are exposed to the intervention, they would respond. For example, if a behavior is maintained by attention, each of the three in attention, contingent, non-contingent attention is the intervention, you would want all three behaviors to be maintained by attention. But at the same time, just because non-contingent attention was given, we would want them to be functionally independent in that it wouldn't automatically impact all three. Mr. Dugan has been working with Steve for several weeks now in his classroom. Steve has exhibited a number of behaviors that interfere with his learning and the learning of those around him, and if untreated, may ultimately result in referral for evaluation for a behavior disorder. He has pinched other students, has repeatedly told others he would get them after school, and has made obscene gestures to apparently get attention from peers and Mr. Dugan. Mr. Dugan has requested that Miss Dobbs assist him in intervening. After using anecdotal recording, the two agree on operational definitions for Steve's pinching, threatening, and gesturing behaviors. They also want to ensure that any intervention attempted will be successful before investing all of their time and effort, so they wish to use it with the more severe target behaviors first, pinching, before investing in each other behavior in the classroom. Once stable responding is achieved, keeping in mind no other students are expressing significant distress or harm from Steve's behavior, they implement their intervention, which is differential reinforcement of other behaviors with response interruption, with the pinching target behavior. The frequency of pinching abruptly decreases to 0 levels after 6 sessions. Meanwhile, baseline conditions data have been maintained on threatening and gesturing, and those behaviors have remained stable. Next, the two implement the intervention on threatening, and that target behavior changes to 0 levels after only 4 sessions. Pinching has remained at 0 levels, and gesturing, the third tier at the bottom, continues to exhibit a steady baseline data pattern. Finally, the intervention is implemented with gesturing, which is decreased to 0 levels after only 3 sessions. Both pinching and threatening have remained at 0. What design is used here? What prerequisites and data patterns would have been established? Now, I've been mentioning multiple baseline and multiple probe design. Procedurally, how do these two designs differ? Well, first of all, they differ in the planned frequency with which pre-intervention data are collected. With the multiple baseline design, you have continuous measurement of all target behaviors, conditions, and participants prior to the introduction of the independent variable. With a multiple probe design, data collection is intermittent prior to the introduction of the intervention. Let's take a look. Here in this graphic, you see baseline data here, and at day 6, interventions put in place when we see an abrupt immediate change in level. For the first tier, while baseline conditions remain low and stable in the following 2 tiers. One thing to note is that you see continuous baseline data taken across all 3 settings. A missing line would indicate that they were not consecutive data collection. Since they're all continuous, we would call this a multiple baseline design across settings. You see in this case, the staggered and time-lagged baseline condition does not have a continuous line, meaning no data were collected between day session 3 and session 8. Therefore, this is an example of a multiple probe design across settings. This is another example of a multiple probe design graphic. The difference is you don't have the actual line drawn to separate the 3 tiers in the stagger. For 3 sessions, baseline data are collected across all 3. These are sets of words. Out of a set of 15 sight words, a set of 5 were taught here, a set of 5 were taught here, and a different set of 5 were taught here. So this would be considered across behaviors, 3 different reading behaviors. So baseline data are collected across all tiers. Intervention is implemented only for set 1, while students are not exposed to set 2 and 3 during this time period. And once the pre-established criteria for mastery is met in the first tier, baseline data are collected again across all 3 tiers. And if it's low and stable, intervention is begun for the second tier. Once that criterion for mastery has been met, baseline data are collected. We want to see maintaining high levels of reading for the tiers that have been taught. We want to see continuation of low baseline data for the third tier, and then we begin instruction for the third set. And once criterion for mastery has been met, our final baseline condition. So here we have 3 replications of effect, but only when the set was taught using a certain intervention did the words become learned. This is a multiple probe across behaviors design. So why do we use multiple baseline or multiple probe designs? They lend themselves to program efficacy measures. You don't have to withdraw the intervention, making it somewhat more ethical, and it's easy to conceptualize. We get internal validity by showing the replication of effects and the functional relation between the intervention and the behavior targeted. If you were to propose a study using this, here would be your general guidelines. These are the 7 steps that would be required for the procedures for implementing this experimental design. I suggest you bookmark this presentation and this page specifically if you are going to propose a study using multiple baseline or multiple probe design. You will use these guidelines in describing your procedures. Let's quickly review them. First, we want to identify 3 or more tiers that are functionally independent yet functionally similar. So prior to the start of the study, you determine your mastery criterion level so you know when to move from one tier to the next. And then at the same time, you're concurrently monitoring all 3 tiers. You want to make sure you've got baseline data that show consistency of effect, and we can establish a functional relation when we see only in each tier as intervention is put in place do we see any movement in that baseline data. Remember, in a multiple baseline design, we have planned continuous data collection during the baseline condition every session on all 3 tiers. In a multiple probe design, we'll collect baseline data for all participants' behaviors or settings, and then we intervene on the first, and then collect baseline data on all 3 again, intervene on the second tier, and then we collect baseline again to show that baseline levels have not changed until intervention is in place. Then we introduce our independent variable, each tier 1 tier at a time, continuous data collection during intervention, and make sure you don't forget your reliability data. Remember your inter-observer agreement. Make sure that data collection is consistent and reliable by having a second observer 20% of the sessions. And you also want to make sure that you're implementing with fidelity. So you have another person come in and check off that you're doing what you say you're doing. That helps us establish high internal validity. The limitations to using a multiple probe or multiple baseline design is in being able to identify functionally independent behaviors. You will have to withhold intervention across participants if it's a multiple baseline across participant study, which could be ethically problematic if the student needed intervention faster. It can be cumbersome to monitor the different behaviors or participants concurrently. And indeed, there is no intra-subject direct replication in this design. We established internal validity with the multiple probe or multiple baseline design with a time lag introduction of intervention by showing that baseline levels stay low and stable while intervention is the only condition impacting the behavior change. And of course, if we have a replication across a minimum of 3 tiers, we can show replication of effect. Some threats that we might see to internal validity could include inconsistent effects of the intervention, meaning at each tier we're not seeing the replicated patterns of behavior change. Premature introduction of the intervention. Remember, before you begin the study, you would have to pre-establish a mastery criteria before changing to the next tier. And with attrition, or only 2 or 1 replications or tiers, that would be a threat to internal validity. So inconsistent effects would look similar to this, where we have baseline levels that are all low and stable, and with intervention, on behavior 1, we see a change, and then only when we put intervention in place at behavior 2 do we see the same change. But then for behavior 3, we don't see a change. Why might this be? Let's think back to those 2 predictions. The behaviors must be functionally similar. Perhaps behavior 3 was not serving the same function as behavior 2 and behavior 1. Therefore, the intervention was not effective. But in this case, you would come up with a new intervention to impact the change. Remember, this is about applied behavior change. And our primary objective is not just to see a functional relation between our intervention and our behavior, but also that we want the student to be successful. In terms of covariation, we see again low stable baseline data across tiers, and only upon intervention in tiers 1 and 2 do we see behavior change. But without intervention, in behavior 3 begins to change, covarying with behavior 2. Why could that be? Let's think back. What is the other prediction we had to make? That was that the behaviors had to be functionally independent. In this case, they're not independent of each other, and when intervention is in place with behavior 2, it impacts behavior 3 inadvertently. This can be good, but we don't have 3 replications of effect with the intervention, so we lose some of our experimental control. Now, external validity is shown with the inter-subject direct replication, if this is replicated across more than one individual. Our visual analysis guidelines are going to be similar to those that we've talked about in the past. We would like to see an abrupt change in level and trend only upon implementation of the intervention at each tier. We want a high percentage of P and D, which would indicate low overlap, and we need 3 replications of effect. Thank you for your attention on this presentation, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day.